Well, let's go to some of the more classic about learning science. Let's say we can engage them. Well, how do we actually teach them science? And this is where it does become very complicated. Again, we've been looking at science education in the classroom for decades, and yet we still have negative perceptions about science. We don't have more scientists in America today. So it's not easy. And I'm not proposing that after school is just going to be able to pick and choose and do things in a very research-based way that's going to solve everything. No, we have to pioneer our own way. And we need to look at these studies, but we can't just discard everything we're good at, because then what's the point, right? We need to take a look at these studies, figure out what works for us. What kind of learning can we expect? What kind of learning should we be measuring? What kind of outcomes should we be promising? So if we talk about learning science, I think one of the most complicated things is this issue of content versus processing. And we think of science as a bunch of facts, photosynthesis, how much does carbon atom weigh? Instead of thinking about, well, how do we even know those things? How do we weigh an atom? That's maybe more important than trying to figure out how much it actually weighs. And this is why I'm probably a failed university professor. As a paleontologist, I never, ever had my students remember the time periods. In fact, I study the Jurassic, that's my expert. I don't even remember when it starts or ends. I don't care. I just care that there are beautiful clams in the ocean in the Jurassic. That's all I care about. That's why I'm not a university professor of paleontology anymore. But to me, content is, I just like I have a job. I say Jurassic clams, for goodness sakes. But the content and the processes are completely two different things. And I think it's after school, we just have to realize that, do we want to teach content? I'm not saying we can't. But do we want to? Or do we want to study the critical thinking? How do you design an experiment? How do you ask a good question? That's the kind of thing that we can do in after school. The other thing is about open-ended versus structured learning. So there's actually quite a big debate, even though classroom educators have really embraced inquiry-based science education. It's actually not that, it's not universally accepted. There is a big influential school of thought in science education that structured, guided learning is more effective at teaching science. And I don't necessarily disagree with all that, because one of the things they point out is that when you let things open completely, is that there are some truths about the world. I mean, wood is not magnetic. There's some things that you know. And if you let people completely be open-ended, how do you then bring it back to what is reality? The other thing about science is that many of us carry misconceptions about science. And when you don't do a structured, guided activity, people end up reinforcing their misconceptions versus learning the quote-unquote true way of the world, physics of the world. But what I'm suggesting is that we don't worry about that in after school. Is that, again, let's take a look at what we should be teaching and what we shouldn't be teaching. If we're not the best at doing this, why waste our valuable time with the students doing this? Why don't we just focus on the stuff we're good at? And if we're good at open-ended, let's just figure out what you should be teaching that's open-ended and not try to teach everything our way. So that's one thing I would be, since I was asked to be provocative for TED, that's what I would say. The other thing is that, what are the true cognitive abilities of children? And I think it's very, very complicated. And so one of the things is, there's this belief that scientists in the crib, kids are naturally inquisitive and they're naturally scientists. Whereas the other school of thought is, yes, they're curious and they're inquisitive, but that doesn't make a scientist. And again, let's understand and accept the fact that that debate is out there, and let's take a look at what we could do. And so what I'll end with is a couple specific studies that I think reinforce what after-school staff can do. One of the things I hear all the time is that, do you really expect the after-school staff to be able to teach science? They are temporary. They move on. They don't have science backgrounds. They probably hated science when they were in school. Their teachers probably hated science when they were in school. And how do you expect this to happen? And the two studies that I'll show you, I think, reinforce that an after-school staff professional who knows youth development, who knows how to elicit questions, who knows how to guide someone's inquiry and growth and maturation, might be better, what I would say, pre-adapted to teaching science than maybe someone who knows too many facts and figures. And let me give you the two studies that have come out recently in 2011. And some of you may have heard of these. These got into the popular press as well. This one in 2011 is Where Science Starts, Spontaneous Experiments in Preschoolers' Exploratory Play. And what they did was they made a little toy and they gave kids beads, and some of the beads would make it light up and some wouldn't. And they wanted to see whether preschoolers would design experiments where they would test individual variables. And that is how scientists work. You don't try to just test two completely different things. You want to, tweak one variable at a time until you figure out what makes it work. Well, the kids not only designed those experiments, they designed an experiment the adults never imagined. So they thought outside of the box of all these PhDs with lots of funding, or somewhat funding, and they ended up beating them. Someone who'd been thinking about this, and they beat them. Another example is the double-edged sword of pedagogy, and this one you probably have heard of, where they gave a made-up toy to kids, and the adult would, there's a couple scenarios. One of the scenarios, the adult would show the child how to work the toy. In those cases, the kids spent less time with the toy, and they did not explore the toy very much. Now, when you had a naive adult, or plain naive, go, I wonder what this toy does. The kids spent more time with the toys, and they figured out more things that the toy did. So thus, both of these examples are examples where I think not knowing very much could be an advantage. Not that you want to go in there ignorant, but the idea that you're open to the fact that you're not a science teacher, but that you are a youth development person, you are a kids person. You can engage them in science and perhaps do it even better than someone who might come in with too many worries about how to do it perfectly and how to deliver lots of information. So be proud of those skills. Those skills might make you the best science educator out there that we have. So again, to sort of summarize, after school STEM, I think one is that being proud of engagement. It is not a second-class citizen to content and processes and learning. Because without the engagement, people don't want to learn more, and you really have to give up on the workforce and workforce development. They could know lots of stuff, but we know that that doesn't mean they'll be a scientist. So let's be proud of that. Two, let's explore this idea of what can a naive educator, a non-expert, a co-learner with the youth, what can they teach effectively, and how should we foster that in our staff? And lastly, let's embrace and not replace youth development values and skills and say that those are actually overlapping, complementary, and in some cases identical to a science educator's skill. So with that, I'm just going to end and say I hope that some of these things about tossing out how to do everything perfectly, how not to replicate everything that's happening in the classroom, it's exactly what we were saying. It's not a competition between different modes of education. It is a matter of being the most effective, the most efficient with our resources and with our children. And to me, as you can tell, I'm passionate about science education. I see science everywhere around me. And it pains me that our youth today, the first thing they want to do when they think about science is run away. That to me is the saddest thing. And it's not just about the economy. It's about looking at our world around us in new ways and finding solutions that we all have to live with. And without them, I wouldn't have had a toddler if I didn't think that there is hope in looking at our society, food, environment, and health. And it is these youth who are going to solve that. So if you want to learn more, just yesterday there was a blog post about the Coalition for Science After School on the Education Week website. And please come to our website or follow me on Twitter or Facebook and LinkedIn. I'd love to hear more of what you're doing and how to think about STEM. Thank you.